Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Expert Insights webinars. I am your host, Don McLean, and today's session is focused on benefit risk assessments for marketing applications, employing a well-structured and thorough approach, presented by MMS. MMS is an innovative, data-focused, and technology-enabled CRO, bringing insights from our global team of highly respected data and regulatory experts across 4 continents. Here to present today is Dr. Aaron Booth and Dr. Amanda Biester. Aaron is Manager of Regulatory and Medical Writing at MMS, based in Canton, Michigan. Prior to this leadership role, Aaron was a program manager at Astrum Biosciences and earned her doctorate in pharmacology from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Dr. Amanda Biester is a Senior Technical Manager of Medical and Regulatory Writing at MMS, with 9 years at the company. Prior to MMS, she spent time in research at the University of South Alabama, where she earned her doctorate in philosophy in microbiology and immunology. Thanks to our presenters for joining us today. As a reminder, your microphones will be muted for the duration of this session, and we'll send out a recording following this call. And if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A at any time via the icon at the top right of your screen. We'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can at the conclusion of today's session. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Aaron Booth. Aaron.
All right, thank you, Don, and thank you to everyone joining us today. Benefit risk assessment is the fundamental basis for regulatory decision-making, and drugs or therapies must demonstrate both safety and efficacy in order to be approved. Historically, a safe drug is where the benefits outweigh the risks. Despite some language around benefit risk assessment in earlier versions of the M4E, it was recognized that the industry needed additional guidance in structuring this assessment because there was really a high degree of variability in the approach taken by applicants in presenting this pivotal information. So as a result, an ICH expert working group was charged with updating the M4E, both section 256 as well as other parts of the clinical overview to ensure its harmonization throughout. And the intent of this revision was really to present the thought process behind the applicant's weighing of benefits and risks, and to facilitate better communication of this thought process to the regulator through critical and succinct presentation of the benefit risk assessment. And this revision was completed in June 2016. So on this slide, I've highlighted the countries and regions that have Step 5 implementation status for the M4E. Per the ICH website, but just keep in mind that in addition to these, many other countries also observe these guidelines. We won't spend too much time on the rationale behind these changes, as the ICH has an excellent resource in the M4E R2 Step 4 presentation, and that's available on their website. So I just wanted to call attention to the resource and to point out that so often is the case, although there is harmonization, there's still a substantial degree of variability as well. So during this talk, we'll address some of the differences between the EMA's PROACT URL and the FDA's benefit risk framework. So one of the tools that we'll be sharing with you today is a workbook or a worksheet, and you'll see this several times throughout the presentation. So keeping in mind that the benefit risk assessment is the fundamental basis of the regulatory decision-making, this is really something that should not be left until the end of the development of the CTD content, and that is often the case. Instead, teams should really begin thinking about this really early during the design of studies that are likely to be pivotal for their application. This really allows for the development of forward-thinking strategies and targeting of all the information in the CTD towards the same singular goal of demonstrating that the benefits outweigh the risks. Practically, what this means is really pulling all of the information that's needed for the risk-benefit conclusions into one place. So this really includes, where are the best and most current information found, and it can be from many different sources, including briefing documents, developmental accompanying core data sheets, top-line results, just to name a few. So using a single organized location to maintain links or notes as you progress through the development of the dossier really lends to a more robust discussion, better first pass writing, and less time rewriting text that's really been developed already. So this OneNote we're sharing with you today is just one example of how this can be done. So first things first, looking at the organization of the CTD and then the scope of the risk-benefit assessment. So the clinical overview is found in section 2.5 of the CTD, and it's intended to provide a critical analysis of all the clinical data in a marketing application, and it should really provide a succinct discussion and interpretation of these findings together with any other relevant items such as pertinent animal data or product quality issues that might have a clinical impact. So the CO ends with a succinct and integrated and clearly explained benefit risk assessment that's really based on weighing the key benefits and the key risks of the medicinal product. So the content of this section within the benefits and risk conclusion is shown here, and it'll be discussed in more detail today. And the assessment of the benefit and risk is approached differently by the EMA and FDA. And today we'll call out some of these differences and how to deal with them when writing a global dossier. So before we dive into the individual components, I just wanted to provide a high-level summary of the assessment framework that were currently used by the FDA and EMA. Amanda is going to talk more about the different frameworks later in the presentation, but with any writing, it's important you keep your audience in mind when drafting a document, especially when it comes to understanding how different agencies may come to different decisions or conclusions after looking at the same data. So even though the benefits and risk conclusions, section 256, is broken into sections that are written at different stages of development, these frameworks should serve as a reminder that the section should be viewed as a whole. For instance, in addition to like a PROS benefit risk assessment, the FDA reviewers will use the benefit risk framework on the left, which generally speaking contains greater detail compared to the written PROS description. So there are many examples of how this is done on the FDA's website, and you can check out the publicly available multidisciplinary reviews to see these. I find that if a comparator has been recently approved, it can be very helpful to look up the multidisciplinary review that's on the FDA website as a reference. And as you can see, the FDA divides this information into two categories. These are the columns you see on the left. Evidence and uncertainties. It presents the facts and uncertainties and any assumptions made to address these uncertainties that contribute to the assessment of benefit and risks. And then conclusions and reasons. They capture the implications of these with respect to regulatory decision making. And then we'll draw conclusions and explain the basis for those conclusions. So the first two rows being therapeutic context or the needs of the patient population, and the bottom two relating to benefits and risk considerations relating to the drug under review. So similarly, on the right side of the screen, the EMA rapporteurs also utilize a framework for structured decision making known as the PRO-ACT URL. And this is actually an acronym for problem, objectives, alternatives, consequences, trade-offs, uncertainty, risk tolerance, linked decisions. So there are a number of details on this framework, as well as examples of drugs that have undergone risk-benefit analysis using this framework available online. So within the benefit risk assessment report template, the rapporteur will summarize the favorable and unfavorable effects, along with any associated uncertainties and limitations, and also generate the effects table. So from this, they'll assess the strength of evidence and begin to justify the trade-offs between the benefits and the risks associated with a specific treatment. So in my experience, the easiest part of this is really to identify the facts and to draw conclusions. And this is often where the team feels the most comfortable as well. Just to keep in mind, it's equally important to formulate the company position and to be able to identify or verbalize any uncertainties of the program and how these are addressed. So it's also key to understand the method of how are we going to assess and weigh the key benefits and the key risks, which will take which we'll talk about more at the end of this presentation. So the first topic we'll tackle is therapeutic context. I'm going to walk you through the factors that should be considered when writing the therapeutic context sections of the risk benefits conclusion. I'll start with the basics, just providing definitions and tips and tricks for working with teams, and later we'll move into trickier questions of assessing the impact of medical need and regional approaches, before spending a few minutes focusing on how-to or best practices for creating the section. So what do we mean by therapeutic context? The ICH defines therapeutic context basically as I've displayed up here on the slide. The contents of the section are typically organized by disease or condition to be treated and current therapies. Overall, the section will describe the disease or condition, the attended population, and the current therapies. When describing the disease or condition, it's really important to consider which aspects are most relevant to or have the greatest impact on the intended population. So keep in mind that the disease or condition is really not always synonymous with the indication, as many products are only intended to address a particular aspect of the disease. That being said, this section typically starts out with an indication statement from the label. I've provided a list of additional things to consider, including in your description, and we'll discuss that in a moment. First, I wanted to address a common issue that we see in clinical overviews generally, and especially during drafting, which is not being anywhere near the recommended page length of 30 pages. In fact, I've seen a clinical team write text for this section alone, which was 10 to 15 pages long. So it's really important that you help your team focus on what the regulatory agency wants to see in this section and present only that content. So depending on your role, you'll need to work with the team to understand which aspects are most relevant to be included by considering where your product has the potential to make an impact, and then to limit the rest of the information to more of a high-level description. So for example, maybe your product works in a mild form of a disease. In that case, you really wouldn't want to waste your word count on the depth of breakdown of the mortality seen in severe disease. Rather, you might frame your discussion of the impact on the treatment of the milder disease, and you can mention the likelihood of progression to the severe form, and then briefly mention the mortality and morbidity of the severe form of the disease. But you're really retaining the focus on the aspects of the disease that will be covered by the proposed indication. Another example would be a preventative therapy, an add-on therapy to extend the efficacy of another product or to treat an adverse effect, or therapies that only address symptoms of a disease rather than treating the disease itself. In each of these cases, maintaining focus on the aspect of the disease you intend to treat or prevent is key to a succinct and focused description of the disease or condition. So in addition to the disease definition and important clinical characteristics, there are many other aspects to consider when drafting this section, and several of them are listed on the screen. So the level of detail needed for any of these points will vary depending on your product, but it's important to highlight any areas of uncertainty or limitations in understanding of the condition or its impacts, especially as it pertains to the proposed indication. So for example, if you're working on a treatment to prevent nausea during pregnancy, incidence of pregnancy would be important, but the real focus would be on the actual condition of nausea during pregnancy. And when you're describing the impact on daily life, it'd be important to focus on the impact of nausea rather than the overall impact of pregnancy or other associated symptoms. So as you can see in our risk benefit workbook, we've included all of these things to facilitate team discussion. This is typically one of the earliest components of the clinical section in a marketing application that can be drafted. And starting with this section also allows for harmonization of introductory text of all of the other clinical components of the dossier. So even if you don't have the exact wording of the indication finalized, there's a good chance you'll be able to talk about the aspects of the disease that would be covered by the proposed indication. Another benefit is that it really just gets your team to start thinking early on about the placement of the product in the armamentarium by writing out some of the public health implications of the disease. They may also remind themselves of the full impact of their findings on a larger scale. So the intent of this section is to summarize current treatment options for the intended population, but this is key. This is really your best opportunity to establish the medical need for a new therapy and often to further define your intended population by really demonstrating that there is a population that remains untreated or undertreated. So although the section is typically written in terms of like efficacy, safety, or tolerability, depending on the safety profile of the drug and the other currently available therapies, the section may also focus on convenience or preference. So you describe the options for treatment and also indicate how well these treatment options meet the medical need for the patient population and where the treatment of this disease has room for improvement. So questions sometimes arise as to what is considered a current treatment. Typically, you'll want to start off your discussion with approved products, but keep in mind that approvals are regional. So for a global dossier, you might need to note these differences. You should also touch on any other significant aspects of treatment used for the indication, even if not approved, such as drugs used off-label, non-prescription drugs, medical and surgical procedures, and non-drug therapies such as diet modifications or physical therapy. So basically, if it's widely used and supported by clinical practice guidelines, you'll want to note it here. If you're fortunate enough to have an established standard of care for reference, possibly from a reputable group of medical professionals or a disease association, those are great places to start. This section typically relies heavily on published literature and USPIs or SMPCs, but be sure to spend some time ensuring that you have the most up-to-date information available, and you should also consider doing a literature search as your submission date nears to ensure that nothing has changed in the regulatory landscape. So these questions, again, are outlined in the notebook to help you initiate the conversation about therapeutic context with your team. And again, it can encourage you to discuss these important aspects of your dossier early and often throughout the development of the dossier. Okay, so unmet medical need. What's meant by unmet medical need? This is determined from the balance of the therapeutic area considerations, both severity of the disease and availability of effective therapeutic options. So unmet need really combines the expected benefit of the treatment, influence on the acceptability of risks of the therapy or the risk attitude. So this is obviously, of course, a matter of clinical opinion and value judgment, but these decisions aren't made in a vacuum. So we'll talk about in a little while how your team will have the opportunity to make your case. So a well thought out and well written description of the therapeutic area considerations can really help you get a good footing for this sometimes challenging task of establishing the unmet need. So to understand seriousness, it's helpful to understand the highest bar, which are the definitions used by the FDA to assign an expedited designation and by the EMA to assign a prime designation or accelerated assessment. So although these are referencing designations given before or at the time of the review, they can still be helpful in understanding how the concepts are viewed by the agencies. The seriousness or life-threatening nature of a disease condition is a defined concept by the FDA guidance, and the guidance can be understood in two parts. First, it's associated with morbidity that has substantial impact on day-to-day functioning. If the impact is short-lived or self-limiting, this usually won't be sufficient, but if the morbidity is persistent or recurrent, it doesn't need to be irreversible. Second is whether a disease condition is serious. It's a matter of clinical judgment, which is based on impacts such as the factors I have outlined on the slide, being survival, day-to-day functioning, or the likelihood that the disease, if left untreated, will progress from a less severe condition to a more serious one. The EMA standard is whether or not the disease is of major public health interest and focuses more on the benefits of therapy. In the EU, the therapy is assessed particularly from the point of view of therapeutic innovation, but targets therapy that will significantly improve patient quality of life. And in the US, the therapy must have an effect on a serious condition or a serious aspect of a condition, such as a direct effect on a serious manifestation of a symptom of a condition. So although these standards are different, there is a definite overlap in what will qualify. So for example, a diagnostic product that improves diagnosis or detection of a serious disease that's a major public health concern and does so in an innovative way that leads to improved outcomes for patients would likely meet the requirements for both regions. Even though it's not directly treating a disease, the therapeutic context sets the stage for the importance of the expected benefit. So just a quick note here, not to let your teams get too short-sighted or operate with blinders on. So when assessing therapeutic context, the reviewers will be considering a wide scope of information, and they're not just going to take your word for it. So I've often heard teams say, we don't want to call attention to that or something along those lines. And just keep in mind that if it's noteworthy, you don't need to call attention to it. At some point, a reviewer is going to become aware of it. And this is really your opportunity to address any limitations. And if you don't clearly explain your point of view now, you're really passing up your best opportunity to do so. So now I'll hand off to Amanda, who will be discussing some identifying, characterizing, and analyzing some of the key benefits and risks.
Thanks, Erin. So as you said, I'm going to start out today talking about the concepts of a key benefit and a key risk, and then I'll dive into some more of the complexities of the final section of the benefit and risk conclusion, which is the actual assessment of benefit versus risk. In these sections, the key benefit and key risks, they are intended to provide a summary and an assessment of all of the submitted evidence concerning the drug under review. And they're typically the most data-intensive portions of the entire benefit and risks conclusions in 256. They'll pull together and summarize information from all of the other components of the submission. Next slide, please. So I'm not seeing this. There we go. Okay, thanks. So what is a key benefit? Well, as this slide states, there are two key considerations when identifying a key benefit. And the first is clinical importance. The clinical importance of a benefit is whether or not it's life-prolonging, curative, disease-modifying, preventative, diagnostics, etc. And then the second important consideration is the magnitude of the treatment effect. The ICH describes magnitude as the absolute difference in the frequency of the effect in the study population versus the frequency in the comparator. And it does state that a relative difference, like a fold change, may also be informative. What this looks like in the real world when we're really writing this section does tend to vary between dossiers. So I think some examples can be useful for understanding a little bit more. There's 3 bullet points on this slide, and they really outline some of the examples we see. One is a combination of study endpoints. It's frequent that we will see a single key benefit described by several study endpoints. An example would be a benefit of improved asthma control. In addition to describing the frequency of exacerbations, you might also see reduced hospitalizations and reduced number of asthma-related deaths, all tied into one key benefit of improved asthma control. Another consideration is whether or not there's other important considerations that might be considered key benefits. This could be convenience, which would lead to improved compliance, maybe a more convenient dosing regimen or a better route of administration. And finally, there may be key benefits that affect those other than the patient population, like vaccines providing herd immunity. So this is really how we identify the key benefits, but we still have some work after this to describe them. So that's on the next slide. When describing the key benefits, it's important to reference the results of clinical trials and the clinical meaning of the primary and secondary endpoints. But other variables that you should describe, in addition to the frequency and magnitude that we just talked about, is the time course for each benefit. So this could mean both the time to benefit or the earliest benefit, but also time to any loss of benefit or tolerance that develops after exposure to the drug, as well as all of the appropriate analyses of variabilities across subpopulations, whether that be a difference of effect due to demographic factors, other disease-related factors, comorbidities, or even drug-drug interactions that can impact efficacy. Next slide, please. So that's efficacy, but there is actually quite a bit more to describe when it comes to identifying key risk. As a result, keep in mind that you may end up with more pages dedicated to the description of the key risk, and that might be something that you'll want to warn the rest of your team about, because some sponsors don't like to see a quote unbalanced appearance of a relatively smaller key efficacy section. So if there's more than one or two key risks, you may end up with more pages in your risk section than in your efficacy. To identify whether or not a risk should be considered key, you'll want to look at the importance from the clinical and public health perspective. It is helpful to take a look at all of the AEs from the perspective laid out here on this slide: the seriousness and severity of the AE, the frequency, the reversibility, are these resolving, and the tolerability, are patients able to continue treatment? But don't stop there. You'll need to continue and consider all of the other possibilities, including potential risks that don't even occur during the development program, but maybe you saw a risk for them in your non-clinical development, or that there's something known with the class of drug. You'll want to make sure that you at least consider those. And also keep in mind that things like tolerance or loss of efficacy may be considered a key risk if you want to be in alignment with how a health authority will be describing it. Next slide, please. Once you've identified each key risk, you will want to describe and analyze it. Similar to how we did with the favorable effects, you'll first want to describe its frequency and time course, but also whether or not those vary across subpopulations. Next slide, please. So I've just summarized the identification and description of favorable and unfavorable effects. But if you stop there, you'll miss an important opportunity to address the uncertainties and limitations of your data. You can rest assured that these will be assessed by the reviewer. So I would encourage you to put in effort to frame these according to your clinical expertise and your understanding of the data. As an exercise, it can be helpful to ask your team to take a step back from the actual data, the numerical, powered, significant results, and ask tough questions about the design of the studies in retrospect and the selection of the population and endpoints, any quality issues that have arisen, or any data that's missing, any gaps in the program. In almost every case, every submission I've worked on, there has been some innate or program-specific limitation that needed to be thought out and discussed in text. Some of these things had been previously pointed out by during our regulatory interactions, depending on the program. In those cases, a robust justification is even more important. Other examples of things to think about as a team are inconsistencies between the findings of the studies and the current compendium of knowledge. I've seen this occur with mechanism of action. Other issues may be understanding of how the disease mechanisms work, also issues with regard to robustness of results. Regardless, you'll want to describe and justify as far as possible any important uncertainties and limitations about the knowledge of the favorable and unfavorable effects, as this will qualify as your strength of evidence for your final benefit risk analysis balance. Next slide, please. And finally, when talking about safety, it's really important to make sure you're including a proposed approach to managing each key risk. This should include an explanation of why the approach provides reasonable assurance that the risk can be appropriately managed. Keep in mind, you don't have to repeat your whole risk management plan here. In some cases where there's a lot of risk management activities, you'll want to pull in the most important, and you can reference what's in Module 1 in your risk management plan. In certain cases, discussion of the overall approach to risk management may be sufficient. If all of your risks are similar or related and they'll all be managed in the same way, you might include this as a final section when talking about risks. Otherwise, you'll want to include the risk management along with the description of each of the key risks. Next slide, please. So we wanted to make sure to talk a little bit more about effects tables, as this is a question that comes up fairly frequently. Effects tables are part of the benefit risk assessment report template for the EMA rapporteurs, and some sponsors like the idea of including a populated effects table in the CO to facilitate the review and decrease workload for assessors, or to be able to provide their position statements in the same context and format that the review will be completed in. It's not required, but it does seem to be something of an emerging trend, so I wanted to make sure we mentioned it here. The benefit to the sponsors, and really to the assessor, is that the effects table does provide a nice consolidated presentation of the effects and of the associated information relevant for the downstream benefit risk analysis, regardless of whether it's qualitative or quantitative. However, there are some drawbacks because you do run the risk of oversimplifying your data to try to make it fit in this tabular format, especially if you have very complex data. So if you do choose to use this display, make sure that you're considering this as a tool to supplement your summary rather than your primary method of communication. Next slide, please. So the risk benefit workbook that we've been talking about, it can aid in the identification, description, and analysis of the key effect of your drug. But this is just one way to do it. The way we've designed it is so that the table can be copied and pasted for each key benefit and each key risk. And then you work through the section to make sure you're answering all of the questions that the health authorities want to see answered in this section. These sections can take quite a bit of time to develop and review. So although there has been in the past a tendency to wait until your SCS and SCE are completed, it does make sense to begin populating these sections of the CO as soon as your top line results are available from your final pivotal study or pooled analysis. And that is definitely a trend that we're now seeing. Another resource to keep in mind through the process of developing this entire section on benefit risk inclusion is the publicly available reviews that Erin mentioned previously. So like she said, the FDA's published many completed multidisciplinary rules, and checking out those HA websites, those health authority websites, making sure that you understand how they're likely to interpret different aspects of your program can be really helpful. It can also be helpful just to look at these if your team is struggling to articulate some component of risk or benefit. Next slide, please. All right, so we finally reached the kind of the end of benefit risk analysis. The final section of the benefit risk conclusion is the benefit risk analysis. So what do we mean by a structured approach here on the slide? Well, as a mom, when I think about structure, I think about organization and having a predefined plan with enough built-in flexibility so I can actually stick to it even when challenges arise, as I know they will. And to some degree, that's what I mean here as well. Over the last 20 years, there's been a big shift in the approach to benefit risk analyses to a more structured or organized, planned, consistent, transparent process. And so while none of that completely eliminates the subjectivity of such an exercise, the changes put in place and potentially those planned for the future does seek to limit that variability in a way that leads to a more transparent and hopefully a more objective approach. Both the FDA and the EMA are transparent on the frameworks that they employ. Aaron walked you through those at a high level early on, but I'd like to call your attention to them again. Next slide, please. So what these two images that Aaron went through already really represent are the predefined processes that the agency will use to come to a decision. Everything we've described up to this point, all the benefits, all the risks, all the therapeutic context, are all components of this process, regardless of the framework that's being employed. Also, note that neither of these are necessarily quantitative, but both of them have quantitative data at the center of their discussions. Next slide, please. So following suit with the agency, there is an emerging trend to use some kind of framework for decision making in pharma. Most often, this is the use of a qualitative framework. These are questions, information gathering, and thought exercises laid out in a sequence that result in an answer. In this case, is the benefit-risk ratio positive? We'll come back to these, but I do want to make a note on quantitative analyses. In this context, a quantitative analysis or decision modeling is an algorithm or some other decision tree or mathematical method used to calculate a numerical score or a ratio that seeks to answer that same question of, is a benefit-risk ratio positive? All types of quantitative analysis do require assignment of a value or superimposing of a value judgment into the analysis. This is usually done in the form of assigning a utility or a weight or a rank or a point allocation. And what all of them seek to do is to put efficacy and risk on the same scale to allow for an analysis of very different data by some form of numeric methodology. However, these can be very challenging and time-consuming and complex. And if there's disagreement on how the value is to be assigned, it can result in multiple sensitivity analyses, which may end up demonstrating that the analysis itself is not robust enough for the wide range of opinions held by the different stakeholders. They can also provide output that is very difficult to really understand. So it's important to consider all of those things, but it's also important to consider agency attitudes with this type of analysis. The FDA has a draft guidance on benefit risk analysis coming out soon, but at one time they stated that the numerous judgments required for these analyses, these quantitative analyses, are at best debatable and at worst arbitrary. The EMA considered a type of quantitative analysis, the MCDA, but instead decided to go with the PROACT URL that Aaron already described. And for the most part, the use of a framework, perhaps one with some descriptive weights applied, is considered to be sufficient. There are cases when a quantitative analysis can provide support for a company's position. Often that's when sponsors are looking at a risk-benefit outcome that is not intuitive, or where there are numerous disparate factors to consider, so that modeling can help those the sponsor to relate all of the different factors. Next slide, please. So this is supported by the ICH, which we have up here on the slide. It says that a descriptive approach is generally adequate. Quantitative approaches are allowed, but applicants are encouraged to consider the utility, complexity, and the extent to which the method is established, as well as the ease of interpretation of the results. So at the end of the day, a quantitative analysis may provide nice graphs, forest plots, or spreadsheets, but if the reviewer doesn't understand, or worse, doesn't agree with how the conclusions were reached, then the value of such an exercise really is questionable at best. Next slide, please. So the question you may have now is how to use these qualitative frameworks. And there are really many answers to that question. But an exercise that a medical writer such as myself can guide a sponsor team through is to take the team through the questions that the agencies will be asking of the reviewers and assessors. For the FDA, these are found in the instructions for completing the multidisciplinary review. And same for the EMA, they're in the content of the co-rapporteur day 60 or day 80 critical assessment report instructions. We've used both of those questions to help generate this OneNote that's showing on the screen here. It is really up to the team to decide how they want to implement the variety of tools available. Some teams have a benefit that is so explicit and obvious that they don't even want to take the time to discuss these questions. However, especially in these cases, I have really seen sponsors scramble to provide the information at the last minute that is needed for this section. So it was really important to consider these questions early on. I think the key is to just not underestimate the task at hand and to make sure you set enough time and mental energy, both of which can be in short supply the closer you get to a filing date, to make sure that you can complete this task. And this often and typically means starting early whenever possible. Next slide, please. So when we really talk about section 2564, the actual benefit risk analysis, don't be discouraged if you find the very beginning of this section to be difficult to write. Teams often struggle to even understand the recommendations the ICH makes for this section, let alone to be able to articulate a response or their position. The M4E R2 recommends that applicants begin this section with, quote, a succinct explanation of the reasoning and judgment used in assessing and weighing the key benefits and key risks, end quote. So in cases where a specific methodology has been outlined, this should be fairly straightforward. If you've already got a framework in mind, you can describe that. However, when that's not the case, one method I've found to be successful is rephrasing and asking the team simple questions. For example, we are stating that this is a positive risk benefit, but why do you believe that the benefits outweigh the risks? In their response, teams will often begin to generate this content. They'll use terms like clinical judgment, relative incidence, etc. And when you start this conversation, this will at least get you started in the right direction. You can then ask the team to help further during the review and continue to remind the team of the purpose of these statements, which, as I said, is to explain how this assessment was applied to the data in your program. Another tough topic at the beginning of this section is the uncertainties that stem from study limitation and data gaps. One approach to deal with this is to ask your team, in an ideal situation, what would you provide in this dossier that we have not included already? Maybe that would be a larger patient population, more subgroup analysis, a better comparator, maybe a fully blinded drug delivery, better understood mechanism of action, more studies of drug-drug interactions. The list really goes on and on. If the team can provide some nice to haves that weren't really possible or practicable, that can be a good starting point for this part of the text. And then you can dive deeper with your team to identify the strengths and limitations of the clinical trials that they do have, the clinical relevance of the endpoints that they were able to use, and the magnitude and durability of the effects that they've seen. It's also important to note any variability in efficacy across subpopulations and making sure that you're understanding whether or not this data can be at least anticipated to be generalized to real-world use. And also to clarify any important missing information or gaps in the data. The second important part of this question is to assess the impact. How do these things that we've all just discussed impact the strength of the evidence that we did acquire? In the example of a small population, maybe there are safety signals that could emerge in a larger sample size. So what's the challenge? Well, often there is a hesitancy to identify shortcomings in writing. I've even been told, like Erin said, I think she said the same thing, we don't want to bring the FDA's attention to that. However, I would counter that in these cases, the reviewer is likely to notice, especially if it's a small sample size or some other deficit. So this is your opportunity to acknowledge that these factors impact your strength of evidence, but to provide the argument that allowed you and your company to make a positive assessment in the first place. Keep in mind that no program is perfect and that only focusing on the positives can create an appearance of being short-sighted or not truly understanding the placement of your product or your program. Next slide, please. So there are several other important components that we've laid out here on the screen. These are a little bit more straightforward. So other things to consider is, of course, including a discussion of the impact of the therapeutic context. How does the severity of the disease and the expected benefit influence the acceptability of the risks in therapy? And how does the medicinal product address the medical need? If you've already done the work to write a robust therapeutic context, you're basically leading yourself into the answering these questions. You've already done a really nice medical needs statement. Now you're answering that with how your medical product addresses those. Other things to keep in mind are the key aspects of risk management important in reaching favorable benefit risk assessment. This is usually some part of the proposed labeling or other materials to be provided to healthcare providers and or patients. Making sure that you can identify patients that shouldn't be taking the drug, as well as any other risk management activities that are going to be important for the safety of the drug in the population intended. Next slide, please. Finally, the FDA created this nice graphic, which we wanted to include here. It can be a really helpful way to view this overall assessment. Notice right away that the therapeutic context is basically the scale that the risks and benefits are being weighed on. So it's very much important, even though sometimes overlooked, very important to state where you're coming from. And finally, risks kind of it's important when you're describing your risk to make sure that you're describing it in a way that shows that you're getting your maximum benefit from the minimal risk through dose optimization, and that your monitoring program, your REMS, or identifying patients that are at most risk can be a mitigation of the risks that you have identified. Benefits are on the opposite side of, if you think of this as a scale. And your trial design and any enrichment that you've done can help improve your benefit or improve how your benefit is placed in this discussion. By being able to measure your direct benefit to the patient population, having the type of trial design that leads to a well-defined magnitude and duration, something that's visible to reviewers and kind of unarguable is best. And finally, making sure that you've identified the patients that are most likely to benefit. I think that is our last slide. So are there any questions?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you, Aaron. Really appreciate that wonderful presentation. We do have 2 questions so far, so if anybody else has any questions, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A. As I mentioned, there's a little question mark near the top of your screen that you can click on to add that. But here is the first question for you, Amanda. I heard that you mentioned that the FDA was coming out with a new draft guidance on risk-benefit analyses. Can you elaborate a bit on what that might entail?
Sure. So in the PDUFA 6 commitment letter and in their implementation plan, the FDA stated that in this year, the fiscal year 2020, they would be publishing a draft guidance on benefit risk assessment. They stated something that they're a clearer understanding of the FDA's thinking of a drug benefit versus risk factor would be their primary intent for this guidance. And they did outline a few specific points on what would be included. I can't recall all of those, but one that I remember is that they were going to articulate their decision-making context and framework for benefit risk assessment. And they mentioned that they would do a case study approach for a drug across its entire life cycle, which I think would be really great to see all the way from earliest clinical development into the post-marketing setting. One other interesting note that they did mention was that they plan to address patient experience data and how that would impact or maybe inform benefit risk assessments.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. We have another follow-up question to that, and then we have an additional question that came in. Follow-up question to this one, though, is what are some sources of readily available patient experience data or real-world evidence?
Yeah, I can take that one, Don. There are several places that you can go to look. The FDA has a patient-focused drug development initiative. So they have public meetings with patient stakeholders for different therapeutic areas, and they have a report called The Voice of the Patient that captures the information and can be found on the FDA's website. In addition, patient advocacy groups often hold meetings or issues surveying patients, and they follow those up with publications. And as you mentioned, real world evidence, there's also an increasing trend to mine publicly available patient data, and especially the real world use of the therapeutics. And those findings are often published, and those published reports can be useful as well, especially for therapeutic context, relating to standard of care, and establishment of unmet medical need.
Okay, great. Thank you, Erin. An additional question that came in is, how do you incorporate agency feedback in the planning of an NDA?
Well, that's a broad topic. So the first thing that comes to mind is in the clinical overview, in the very first section in 251, you have the opportunity to, and actually the recommendation to list out your agency interactions. If you have received feedback that you are incorporating, it's really great to list that out there and state how you've incorporated that feedback. Also, if there's anything that you're not following to a T, if you have some justification for why not, it's good to list that out there as well. And then as far as incorporating agency feedback into an NDA, that can be anywhere from, changing a SAP if they aren't in alignment with some of your statistical analyses, all the way to, including another meta-analysis or something large that you hadn't planned to before. So there's really a wide, depending on what the agency feedback is, there's really a wide range of activities that may have to occur. But usually that is coming from your pre-NDA meeting. So kind of knowing what questions you're going to ask can help you plan for incorporation of the feedback that you're going to get.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Erin. And if that person that submitted has a follow-up question, we do have an email that's on the screen. If you'd like to send any questions and follow-up, we can connect you and Amanda directly. So no problem at all. We do have one last question. Is there a way to start negotiating post-marketing commitments upfront in the benefit risk discussion so we can offer up something ahead of time we are willing to do?
So you can describe those as your part of your risk mitigation procedures. If you're talking about risk, you can include them there. Especially if your post-marketing commitment, if you're talking about additional studies to be done, you can briefly address those there. Keep in mind that this clinical overview is supposed to be relatively brief. So as far as the clinical overview, there's not going to be a lot of room for, including a protocol or anything along those lines. But I think that you can mention them as in brief as part of your sort of risk mitigation for the drug, if that's what you meant by that question. Erin, anything additional to add on that? Not sure
No.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all I can think of as well.
Wonderful. And again, the same thing. If there's any additional questions or follow-ups, please go ahead and follow up with your point of contact at MMS directly, or we can email media@mmsholdings.com and I'll connect you with either Amanda or Erin directly. So no problem at all. All right. Well, thank you for answering those questions, Amanda and Erin. Those are that's the end of our questions today. So if anybody would like to join an additional free webinar, please just visit mmsholdings.com/webinars or follow us on LinkedIn for updates. Again, as I mentioned, if you have additional questions, please email us at media@mmsholdings.com. And thank you very much for listening. Enjoy your day.